My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual discussion on modern-day Pilgrims, the history of the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference, with the volume's editors, Reverend Dr. Ron Hamilton and Reverend Alwyn York. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, manuscripts, periodicals, and print, as well as our digital archive, which has more than 100,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and virtual programs like this one, and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. Please check our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about our programs, especially ones that we have coming up. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Reverend Dr. Ronald E. Hamilton has served as the 4Cs Conference Minister since 2012, and previously worked as Director of Church Multiplication from 2007 to 2012. He was founding pastor of the Woodbury Community Church in Woodbury, Minnesota, where he served for nearly 30 years. He's deeply committed to the development of healthy congregations with a commitment to missional ministry. Reverend Alwyn York currently serves as the conference historian of the 4Cs and served a previous term, 2006 to 2013, as the conference historian. He writes a regular column on congregational history for the newsletter of the 4Cs and has conducted seminars on historical topics at the annual meetings of the conference since 1995. He is the author of Rediscovering Congregational Foundations and of several articles published in the Banner of Truth magazine. Reverend York is retired from pastoral ministry after a 34-year career where he served churches in Wisconsin, New York, Pennsylvania, and Montana. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Dr. Hamilton to start us off.
Well, thank you everyone for participating with us today. And the first thing we want to do is to give a very quick overview of the history of the 4Cs. All of this writing that has been done, that's being promoted in this webinar, is a celebration in conjunction with the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference. We met in St. Cloud, Minnesota last July, had a wonderful celebration of thanking God for the 75 years of history. It was also our desire as we approach that time to go back and to redo the wonderful work that was done in the original volume, Modern Day Pilgrims, A Proud Heritage, and to get that updated, and then also to tell the story of what God has done in the conference over the past 25 years. The 4Cs actually started officially in 1948, but the history goes far beyond that, back into the 30s, in which a fellow from Minnesota, Hilmer Sandin, began to develop a newsletter called the Congregational Beacon. As I go back and think about that in light of the task that we had of doing what we've done for this historical volume, I have to admire the persistence of those people. This was when communication was not nearly as effective as it is today, digitally or anything along that line. They had to work very hard to write, to print, to mail. It took quite a commitment of these early forefathers of the 4Cs to look and to say, we care much about the preservation of Orthodox theology and biblical congregationalism and also congregational polity. And so they began to communicate across the country through this vehicle, the Congregational Beacon, and that led them to call a meeting in Chicago, Illinois in 1948 to officially begin the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference. The early days of the history of the conference were of a group that was more of a fellowship, wanting identification with the values that were championed in the Congregational Beacon. but it then became a place where people wanted to get together and share together life and understand what God could do in the promotion of biblical congregationalism in their generation. The growth of the conference was slow over a period of time, and as we turned the century, it was about 300 churches. Today, we've got 305 member churches with 801 member ministers. The conference is quite diverse at this time because we are welcoming people that come from non-congregational backgrounds to join us in fellowship, either as ministers or as churches. We do have historic congregational churches that are with us, churches from the Evangelical Reformed Church, independent churches seeking fellowship, and other churches that are seeking a new home. And so what we want to do in this is to be actively involved in helping people know not only the history of Congregationalism, but what God is doing in a congregational fellowship today. One of the more exciting things that we're doing today is actively involved in planting new churches of congregational polity all across our country. And that's an exciting adventure that's engaging the next generation. Thus the theme of our book that is the second volume, Modern Day Pilgrims, A New Generation. So we've enjoyed being an active part of the congregational heritage for some time and are so thankful for this opportunity to speak to you today about who we are in the Four Cs, what God has done, and what we believe he will do in the future.
Well, I guess it's my turn. So I'm Al York, coming to you from Billings, Montana this morning. And we're certainly thankful to Kyle for the invitation to take part in this. So I want to talk a little bit about Volume 1, our history of the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference is 2 volumes now. And it was my task to edit the first one, which is a revision of the first edition published for the 50th anniversary. And so as the 75th anniversary was approaching, there was the idea, well, it would be good to update our history. And we discovered several problems that were facing us. The original history had gone out of print. We discovered nobody could get a copy of it. And as we debated just how to approach this revision, whether to just add a supplement to the existing book, but as we entered into discussion, it became clear that there had been enough new developments and restructuring over the last 25 years that to adequately do that, we should have a separate new volume. And so, Ron, that you've just heard from, took on the task of editing that second volume. So I'm going to talk about Volume 1, which is now subtitled A Proud Heritage. And it was more than just a history of the Conservative Conference itself, because it involves segments on some of the groups that were the background of churches that have entered our conference. The majority of them are from a congregational background, although part of it, there's also those that were part of the Christian Connection, a group of more Southern churches and who wanted to be known simply as just Christian. There are several different ethnic components represented within the conference. One of the larger ones for us is the Germans from Russia, mostly in the Great Plains state, a group of churches that had immigrants who had been living on the Russian steppes and wanted to continue their identification with a strong evangelical belief and brotherhood. And so we have these different groups that are represented. Also, a number of churches from the Evangelical and Reformed Church have joined the conference in recent years. And so part of our heritage is those churches that trace their origin back to the Reformation in Germany. And so it is truly a diverse body of churches. And as I was approaching revising that, the original book was designed really just for the present moment when it was published. That there are things in it that are projecting things into the future, or hopes and aspirations, and some of that was just was outdated, no longer relevant. And so I had the issue of facing what is of continuing relevance for people going forward, and what, what could be eliminated in the revised version. We also had a challenge because the book had gone out of print, and the files necessary to reprint it had been lost. And so we had to kind of recreate it. Kim Gardell, a member of our committee, digitized the whole thing with the optical scan process. So there were introduced all kinds of typos into it, which had to be cleared up. But we were concerned that the history that was done for the original book on the origins of the conference and the early years of it, we were concerned that that would be preserved for future generations. And so it was, what was produced was truly a new edition, a revision, and not just a reprint. And again, the focus is on the first 50 years of the conference, although we have added some sections to update some of the reports on the ministries of the conference. So that basically gives you an idea of what Volume 1, the Proud Heritage volume, is about. So, and it was Ron is the editor for Volume 2, which has the subtitle now, A New Generation.
Well, we so much appreciate the work that Alwyn did in the editing of the volume number 1, and we need to also give him credit because as we worked through volume number 2, he also helped us do some very critical editing, and we so much appreciate his work. What we desired to do as we approach the 75th anniversary is to really record what God had done in the 4 Cs over the past 25 years. And we knew that some people would just choose to look at one volume rather than looking at the longer history. And so we began it by giving a detailed history of really what it means to be biblical Congregationalists. Our former conference minister, Steve Gammon, gave some overview of this, and then Nick Renitsis, who taught the Congregational Standards course up at Gordon Conwell, also gave us some good history of biblical Congregationalism. And as we did this, we saw that this truly was a springboard to what God had been doing in the 4 Cs over the past 25 years. It's very interesting as we engage people to participate in this. It was not hard to get people to come along because they were excited about the ministry of the conference and wanted to share in the recording of it. We actually had 12 different authors that contributed to the development of that book in different ways, former leaders, current staff in the conference. Many folks participated in that. But what really happened is we described a missional shift in the conference. We believe that in the early days, the people came to the conference more for fellowship, like-minded pastors and churches to come together to have an identification clearly as people who wanted to align with historic biblical Congregationalism. To now, in the last 25 years, to really be a group of people that would move from just simply a fellowship to like-minded people with a shared life and a shared mission. It was very interesting as we wrote it that it kind of broke down very naturally into some 5-year segments in which we describe missional shift in the conference. It begins by recording the fact that our conference minister, Cliff Christensen, had wanted us to get involved in the mission of planting churches. There wasn't much going on in that, but at the 50th anniversary, that became a discussion and people began to move and ask the question, what can we do together that we can't do by ourselves? And so the history really records some different epics of what God had done in that light over a period of 25 years. And in each one of those, it described periods of missional shift, starting with times of prayer and vision, describes times when God called certain people together, even small groups, to say, God, what would you do through us in these coming days? We prayed together. We had times of visioning that led to new structure, different committees that were formed, task forces to oversee and see what God was doing. We had a guiding coalition that developed the ministry of the conference and reframing it, and then a structured task force that worked to bring new structure to the conference. And all those things, starting with prayer and vision, and then new structure in ministry. And then immediately upon those times, God would provide resources of people and finances for us to step into the next level of what God had in store for us. I think one of the more exciting parts of this is that it concludes with a vision statement for the future, that we have a group of young leaders that envision that God will continue this ministry in the next generation. Great ideas of building on the foundation of what it means to be a biblical Congregationalist in the 21st century, understanding the great deep history we have, not only here in America, but historically back in Europe, and then saying we want to see this continue in this generation. It's really exciting to be able to see these things, and for all of this to be a model for oversight and development and growth of ministry at any level. My predecessor, Steve Gammon, was a part of developing this, and he said, really what we want to do is to tell the next generation, this is how we do God's work together. We pray, we seek his will, we work hard together to build structure around ministry, what God is calling us to do, and then we trust him for the resources. And I believe that the history that's here gives us the opportunity to share that. So I would encourage you to read through that and to kind of see those themes repeated over a period of time. People gathering together, prayer and vision, and then developing structure to make this really happen. And then also then seeing how God provides and he resources what he wants to do among his people. It was a real joy to bring these people together and to develop this volume. And we think it'll be a real contribution to what God's going to do in the coming days through the ministry of the 4 Cs.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Let me invite Al to come back up. Let me just start off with kind of, one question, and that, I'm here in Boston. Ron, you're in Minnesota. Al, you're out in Montana. But Congregationalism is a bit of an international phenomenon. And I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about the relationship maybe between, how does the 4 Cs engage internationally? And, is this, because I think this is really more than just an American story that you're telling here.
Yes, well, I think Ron is probably the one to speak to that because he is representative to the World Evangelical Congregational Fellowship.
I would be happy to speak into that. So we probably not, probably about the time of our 50th anniversary, sometime beyond that, we're part in forming the World Evangelical Congregational Fellowship. And today that's represented by 19 member nations around the world. And what we found the joy was that God's work spread through congregational missionaries all around the world. And these churches were planted and ministry started in 19 different nations. And so today we actively participate in the World Evangelical Congregational Fellowship. We hold triennial meetings, and the last one that we had was held we hosted it here in 2016. Then in 2019 we went back to our real historical roots and met in England. That was a wonderful time together. But one of the things that I think is important to understand is that as we look at the World Evangelical Congregational Fellowship today, that the largest number of biblical Congregationalists actually come from Hispanic background. And Brazil, and also Argentina. We're going to hold our next triennial meeting in Argentina. We were down there for a midterm meeting and to see what they are doing to promote the ministry of Congregationalism, and that place is really phenomenal. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from them today, training young students, planting churches, quite an exciting adventure. It was interesting that you raised that question. Yesterday, I was on a webinar with the leaders of the World Evangelical Congregational Fellowship, and our desire is to do our very best to keep this alive and active and to bring together Congregationalists from all across the world to share in this great story of what God is doing.
But yeah, the Brazilian connection is interesting. It's something, there's a very, very large, actually 2 evangelical congregational denominations in Brazil. And I remember once, you know, how sometimes you Google yourself, and I discovered that, I discovered an article that I had written, transferred into Portuguese. So that was very interesting for me to see.
You know, you tell such a powerful story in the New Generation volume about the last 25 years. And I'm curious, when you look at the, you know, the other member nations of the World Evangelical Fellowship, did you find that the 4 Cs has been sort of a leader in the shift towards church planting? Or did you maybe find sometimes that there were other nations that might have been, other nation churches that were kind of inspiring you and maybe pushing you to think about that pivot in that direction?
Well, I would humbly tell you that I believe, particularly in Brazil and in Argentina, they have really led the way in that. When we went to the meeting in Brazil, I walked into a room and I saw a picture on a wall, a mural of a tree. And so I walked over to it and I said, "Can you explain to me what this is?" And they said at the root, it was the first church planted by missionaries in Argentina. And then it showed all of the different churches that have been planted in Argentina since that time. I can tell you they have been much more active in church planting than we have been in the last 25 years. And I was very stimulated and encouraged by the ministry. The similar things have happened in Brazil. The things that they're doing to plant churches and to impact their nation is tremendous. I would say that it's more of a challenge in Europe these days, but particularly in Eastern Europe, we are finding churches, particularly after the fall of communism, when they could reopen churches, that there was a very active effort to do church development work, churches that have been closed for some time, to get them going, and also to plant new churches. And so that has happened quite a bit in Eastern Europe at this time also.
Great. I think there's a question here from Phil Loughlin, which I think sort of follows on. You know, Phil writes, all the mainline denominations have experienced declines in their number of churches and the number of members. What has been the experience of the 4 Cs in the past 10 years or so? And I think it's read the book, part of the answer. Yeah. You want to talk about the last decade?
Yeah. I'll speak into that quickly. Al might be able to say something. So we saw some fairly significant growth at the end of the 20th century. Growth has been just really stable in this century, in the first number of years. You know, some people don't understand, but 4,000 churches close in America every year. And we've seen that happen. We've seen churches that have a historic congregational background that were built in communities that have changed dramatically, and the people are not there anymore. And we have developed a process called Turning Point, in which we're trying to do our best to keep churches alive in communities where churches are truly struggling. But we have not really seen decline in membership, but we've not seen a rapid incline either. It's been a challenge, but we're very thankful for the fact that we do add new churches to our membership every year.
But I should say that our conference grows really in 2 ways: by existing churches coming into our conference, often having a previous affiliation. So that's one way the conference has continually grown. But also then, as Ron has mentioned, in recent years, we've had more of an initiative to plant new churches. And so we have seen just a pattern of steady growth.
One of the things that I felt in reading this was that when people talk about American religion these days, it's easy to focus on the negative. But I felt like in what you wrote, there was a real spirit and maybe a real determination to focus on the positive aspects. Was that kind of a choice that you made in sort of thinking about how you wanted to talk about the Four Cs and its relation? Or is it just maybe just a reflection of how you go about the work and it just kind of naturally comes from it?
Alwyn, why don't you speak to that and then I'll speak to it.
Well, I think more than a decision by our editorial committee, but it's a reflection of just kind of the overall ethos of the conference, that it's been quite forward-looking and just strategizing for the future. And so that's just, I guess it's just naturally that would be reflected in the book.
And I appreciate saying that, Alwyn, because I think if you look back over the 75 years, that has been a common theme. People enjoy being together, are deeply committed to doing God's kingdom work in the generation that God has placed them, and that has been maintained over a period of time. I think, as I said, as I drew together the people who contributed to the second volume, it was not hard to get people to work. They were excited about what God was doing. And they said they enjoyed going back and studying some of the things they've been involved in to record that and to be sure that that was written so that other people could see it in the days ahead. I think that the Four Cs has a very strong spirit. We are not blind to the challenges that there are today to doing God's work as churches in this generation, but I think we are very forward-looking and relying on God's Spirit for the life and energy to honor Jesus Christ in this generation.
Yes, I think people in the conference have kind of an ambivalent feeling about that word conservative in our conference name, because the conference is about much more than just conserving things. I mean, of course, some people associate that with conservative politics, which we don't want to particularly identify with, but really it's forward kingdom work and not just trying to preserve what we have.
That's great. I think that's very helpful. Following on your answer there, Joseph David Stinson asked, could you talk a little bit about who some of the other authors are in the Next Generation volume? Who was part of the crack team that helped put the story together?
So fortunately, I have it right in front of me, so I couldn't remember, but we did have our former conference minister, Steve Gammon, who's deeply committed to not only understanding and promoting Congregationalism in this generation, but digging into the history and finding some of those common frameworks. And so he participated. As I mentioned earlier, Nick Granitsis, former president of the conference, really dug into the history and gave us a concise chapter that way. Former conference minister Cliff Christensen participated in sharing some things. We also had former President Paul McFeeters, current staff members, Director of Church Development John Kimball, and the Director of Church Multiplication Brian Long. We had Larry Wood, who was the president of the conference when we were going through the guiding coalition. We were looking to see what the next structure was. And then Todd Venman, also a former president, who led the structure task force and that at that time. We brought together also our people like our treasurer and controller that talked a little bit about the joy of seeing God provide. And then also Terry Shanahan, who's from New England, just retired as our Northeast regional pastor. He wanted to tell the story about how God was building a conference care ministry that now has resulted in 4 regional pastors across the country. And he laid the foundation for that, as did his predecessor, Carlton Walker. So we brought all those people together. And as I shared, they were enthusiastic about being actively a part of making a contribution.
Al, you had mentioned the name Conservative Congregational Christian Conference, and there's a great question here from Pat Bondel, a good friend of the CLA, about that. And she asked, what is the earliest date you found that that the Congregational Church decided to become a conservative congregational church? At what point in the history did the name sort of start to adhere? Is it a product of the 1930s? With Sandrine, does it have an older history to it? And maybe also talk a little bit about when did Christian come into it? Was it Congregational Christian from the start, or did that change?
Okay, well, maybe take those questions in kind of reverse order. The Christian part of it is meaning it has a more specific meaning than just followers of Jesus Christ, that there was a Christian denomination, that there were several movements of this American movement to try to get back to the primitive church and to do away with a lot of the traditions and people who wanted to be known as just Christian without a denominational label. And that group merged with the Congregationalists in 1931. And so that's where the Congregational Christian came from. I think the word conservative just came in as the conference was organized. And as has been mentioned, it was an outgrowth of a newsletter that had been just kind of independently produced, bringing together like-minded people who were conservative or evangelical in their theology. But in 1948, I guess the preliminary discussions of the formation of the United Church of Christ alarmed the more conservative Congregational Christians in a number of ways, and it was time that they felt that they needed to have a closer fellowship develop. And so originally the conservative group was meant to be a fellowship within the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches. But then they decided that they needed to have a more formal structure and organization. And I guess as a number of Congregationalists felt, as the United Church of Christ was being formed, that they were worried about preserving their autonomy, which was an important congregational value. And so out of that grew our conservative conference, but also the National Association of those that were concerned about the greater centralization that would seem to be looming over them as the United Church of Christ was being formed.
I would just add to that I believe that the label conservative really started when the denomination was formed in 1948. Over the years, we've had different attempts to describe what's in a name. Certainly, I shared a couple of years ago that our forefathers gave us a mouthful, Conservative Congregational Christian Conference, helping people to understand that the conservative piece does not relate to politics or anything along that line, but truly the desire to maintain an orthodox biblical theology.
I can confess that here at the Congregational Library, we should probably hand out little note cards with acronyms on them. Because we just, 4Cs, NACCC, UCC, we throw them around all the time. And I realize that for those who are not initiated into all of these, that it can sometimes get confusing. But thank you. I think that's a really great explanation. I do want to kind of share in this, the show and tell part, right? So at the Congregational Library, we have almost a complete run, not quite a complete run, of the Congregational Beacon, which is, of course, the early newsletter for the 4Cs. And, it's absolutely, a fantastic resource. And Ron and I were talking earlier about whether this might be something we want to prioritize to get digitized, if it's not, available for folks to look at. I'm curious, and maybe Al, I'll put you on the spot. What are some other sources that, if somebody wants to learn more beyond these volumes about the history of the 4Cs, that they can start looking into? I think the Beacon is a great source for the early years, the 4C for now, but where else should people be looking?
There aren't a lot of published sources. I mean, the conference has published a newsletter through the years, but no, I guess we need to do a better job of archiving it. But I guess I'm not really aware of historical works about our 4C conference itself.
Well, this was not, I was not saying that to to say the 4C should be doing more. I mean, I think in many ways that these publications are actually really important, that other denominations aren't necessarily publishing kind of up to the minute histories of the work that they're doing. And I feel like there's so much oral history that's encapsulated in these as well, which is great. But if people have archives of 4C material, please reach out to Al and reach out to me here at the library, because we want to preserve this history. Question here from Nick Pruitt, thinking about, and you touched on this a little, Al, do you feel like the way the history of the 4Cs has been told has changed over time? Have there been different emphases at different times, different parts of the history maybe that are brought more forward and sometimes maybe talked less about?
I think early on, the conference had a more, I don't know if I want to say belligerent, but more kind of militant stance, and I guess maybe, well, a great concern of distinguishing itself from the theological movements that they were in disagreement with. So there was more of a polemical edge to it. And I think in recent years, especially, there is more of an emphasis on, I guess, more positive things of church planting and church development and leadership development, and less of a focus on just talking about what we're against.
And I would just simply add to that I think that when we reach our 50th anniversary, some of the people say, to what end? We knew what we were not, but did we truly know who we were? And I think that was clearly identified through this process, like I say, prayer and visioning. God, tell us who we are and how we can be effective in this generation. And so we see in historic Congregationalism that we value autonomy, but not truly independence. We think that historically Congregationalists have worked together to do great things, even in the foundation of our nation, beyond just planting churches, to form colleges and universities and hospitals and missions and all those things. And so we're trying to recapture some of that and saying, what can we do together in shared life and shared mission? And of course, when you do that, then it has to be positive thinking and reliance upon God's Spirit to guide us.
Really nicely said. Question here from Andrew McHenry. He says he remembers reading the name Finnish Luther Congregational Church with some frequency in the history of how the 4Cs started. And he's curious about Scandinavian or Lutheran roots to the 4Cs. Is that something that either of you have come across in your...
Yes, I can speak to that. That in the late 19th century, the Congregationalists had a number of foreign language divisions. They worked to plant churches among some of the new immigrant groups that were not that were not English speaking, and so they had particular outreach to Germans and Scandinavians. At the Chicago Theological Seminary, they had a training institute for pastors in Norwegian and Swedish, and the Finnish movement was smaller. But over the course of time, most of their work among the Swedish and the Norwegian didn't lead to enduring results for the Congregational movement, because those people tended to organize their own denominations. And so the Swedish became the Evangelical Covenant Church, and the Norwegian became Evangelical Free Church. And so a lot of the early work among those immigrants was done by Congregational pastors. And we do have within the Four Seas several churches that are of a Finnish ethnic origin. The largest ethnic group within the Four Seas, I mentioned before, are the Germans from Russia, who are in the Dakotas and Nebraska and Colorado. And that's a whole whole history in itself.
If I could just add something to that, we are actually doing a work of replanting some churches out northwest of Boston. And there's a group of churches up there that have a Finnish heritage, and they've kind of banded together. One church closed, they gave their assets to another church, and they're cooperating to try to keep something going. But all of those churches have a Finnish background, and had a pastor named Heikkala who served up there very actively for quite a few years. So yes,
that's great. I am sort of curious that being born in the Midwest, as opposed to being born in New England, right? And if Congregationalism is sort of born in England, reborn in New England, and then but do you think it's made a difference for you to be located in Minnesota, have the headquarters in Minnesota, to have such a Midwestern presence? I mean, recognize that you have churches everywhere, but I'm just sort of curious if the Midwest inflects, or the Four Seas in any sort of way.
I think as we went beyond New England, those churches because they moved on from New England, always had kind of a stronger sense of mission. And I think in New England, maybe preservation was a very important part. And so I think the whole idea of moving west and into the Midwest probably has increased the sense of a desire for mission and openness to that. No criticism. We've got a lot of churches in New England that are doing very well and are missional, but I think historically that's been one contribution. These people and in their heritage ventured out a bit, and I think that's added to the idea of us having a truly missional ministry.
But yeah, as you look at the membership of the Four Seas today, the bulk of our churches are in the Northeast, but the origins was Midwest, and maybe in the Midwest there were more people who were more conservative in theology. But another significant influence on the Four Seas has been Gordon Conwell Seminary, and Harold Ockenga was, had a large role in the formation of the National Association of Evangelicals, but also in the Four Seas. And I think the ethos of the Four Seas really reflects a lot of his emphases and approach.
I like that you've mentioned Gordon Conwell, because there are two questions in here about maybe expectations for training for Four Seas ministers, or schools that you find new ministers are coming out of. I'm assuming Gordon Conwell is still an active connection for you. Are there other schools that you're kind of working with, or how does the Four Seas sort of approach education for ministers?
So we have had for a while what we call seminaries of choice. Gordon Conwell was one of them. Westminster Theological Seminary, the strong Reformed background. Also Trinity, because of the fact that even though they are not a part of our movement, share that as Alwyn has said, that traditional congregational polity and things along that line. I can tell you right now, this is a huge challenge. Theological training is in huge transition, and we are finding pastors coming to us out of a whole variety of backgrounds, and online education is something our credentials committee is actively involved in trying to deal with this and try to speak into it. And we have tried to develop some of our own resources for the training of pastors with congregational heritage and also systematic theology, maintaining some of the doctrines that we believed in and things along that line. So it's one thing today that's kind of up in the air. Educational institutions are struggling these days, and we're trying to find the very best way that we can service that.
So there is no one path, I guess, for training for Four Seas ministers. Some of them have a traditional seminary education, but I think as Ron has kind of indicated, there's more of a movement toward, toward distance education or online. And through the years, there have been a number of pastors who were already serving churches. They were already ordained, and then along the process, received more education and training for that. But the Four Cs never had a seminary of their own.
Well, I think that turn to distance education, right, and that turn to kind of thinking about 21st century modes is another way to really be thinking forward, right? To be thinking about how do we connect and how do we bring resources. It's something the library, of course, we're not an educational institution, but we are, through digitization, through programs, trying to figure out how people who cannot easily drive into 14 Beacon Street, Boston, can get information. And I think we're all kind of wrestling with trying to figure out how to do the best job we can with that. There's a nice question here from Jeff McDonald, who, and this might be a way to kind of talk a little bit about how you're structuring the church multiplication effort. What percentage of the Four Cs churches kind of have full-time clergy or are built on a full-time clergy model, or is there another model that you're using for this kind of multiplication, especially as we think about how things get more and more expensive, right? Upkeep of buildings and such.
That's really an excellent question, and frankly, we have stuck fairly close to a model of vocational ministry along this line. What this requires, though, it requires something whereby the pastor, particularly in planting a church, has to find resources outside of the congregation, because a new congregation is either non-existent or very small. And so trying to find multiple places where they can find resources through their own fundraising and partnering with different groups along that line. And we are thinking in terms of really the future of not what we're calling bivocational ministry, but co-vocational ministry. That means basically finding a ministry that's done in Christ's name that is outside of the church, and people working that way. So some people serving as chaplains, both institutional and serving organizations, different things along that line. And so we've switched a bit from thinking simply in terms of bivocational to co-vocational. You're still involved, but maybe all of your income is not coming directly from the local church that you serve. The other thing is, I think we're finding this is just an economic reality. We have a number of pastors that their spouses work and help support the ministry. And whatever we call that, whether shared life and mission or bivocational ministry, but a number of our pastors entering ministry are quite dependent on their spouse to help support the family.
There are two questions here about your 4C statement of faith, and I'll try to put them together. One was about the discussions that led to its adoption, and the person who wrote the question says that it feels almost identical with the National Association of Evangelicals statement of faith. And then the other question is basically the same. It's kind of the same question. What was the process that led to the creation of that statement?
Well, I think Alwyn already talked about the influence of Harold J. Ockenga. He was a prime mover in the foundation of the National Association of Evangelicals. And I think that the Four Cs, when it founded, said we can't do much better than that. And they thought it really reflected who we were. I don't have a lot as far as the history of that. I don't know if Alwyn can speak to that or not.
I don't have more detail on that, but just to mention that is something that our unity as a conference has depended on. And one of our kind of slogans is unity with diversity. And so the Four Cs is kind of unique in that we don't have distinctive doctrinal positions beyond that. The Four Cs is a fellowship within which there are different views of eschatology, about the spiritual gifts, women in ministry, all those gifts that are in baptism. In the 4 C's, we do not have just one practice of baptism. That is something that is left to the discretion of the individual church. And so we have found just the attitude or approach of unity with diversity is something that makes for close fellowship and just I think appreciating one another as Christians, even if there are things that we disagree about.
Well, there are many questions in here, which I'm going to send along to all of you after this. We're kind of reaching the end of our time. I did want to kind of ask a sort of bigger question. Here at 14 Beacon Street, if you go into our reading room, you walk by the original Bible box that was in the Scrooby Church. It is a fantastic piece that was given to us in 1888. Where I sit in my office, I have 2 images of the Mayflower Compact and the Pilgrims on Clark's Island. We're coming up on Thanksgiving. Why do you think Congregationalism has been so enduring within American religion?
Well, it's there's been kind of a mutual relationship, I think, between American politics and congregational. I think the capacity for self-government is something that developed. A lot of people have commented on this, like within the town meetings and church meetings in New England. And so it has not been intensely sectarian. I mean, in many of the churches across the country, the Congregational church was sort of the community church. It was not a church that was out there with a very ironclad, exclusive doctrinal position, but allowed a range of diversity within it. And so again, in many, I discovered in history, in many of the communities, as the West developed, the Congregational church was a church where people from a variety of backgrounds could come together and feel comfortable. And so I think that self-government is something which is a foundational principle of Congregationalism, and which, of course, is very compatible with the American ethos. And so it's the origins of Congregationalism are in England, but really, as it developed, it's just a form of church government, of organization, which is very compatible with the American ethos.
I would simply add to that. I believe strongly in the future of this, as people find huge polarization in our culture, a place where they can come together and find something common to believe in and to work together in. I think that speaks well to the future of Congregationalism in America.
Amen. That's great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your time with us today. Ron, Al, thank you so much. Have a fantastic Thanksgiving, and know how much we appreciate your time today.
Thank you for the invitation. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.